Spring 1943. North Atlantic. Elite German U-boat commanders, men who had terrorized Allied convoys for years, began reporting something impossible. American destroyers that appeared out of nowhere like phantoms, struck with supernatural precision, then vanished into the fog before torpedoes could even be fired. These weren't the crude, inferior ships Berlin had promised. They were something the Kriegsmarine had never encountered, and U-boat crews whispered a name in fear: Graugeister, the Gray Ghosts. But what technology did these American destroyer escorts possess that turned history's most feared submarine hunters into the hunted? And why did 75% of U-boat crews never make it home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1942, the Atlantic Ocean belonged to Germany. Massive gray submarines called U-boats prowled beneath the dark waves like hungry wolves. They hunted Allied ships carrying food, weapons, and supplies from America to Britain. Month after month, these submarines sent hundreds of ships to the bottom of the sea. The men inside those sinking vessels screamed as cold water rushed in. Their cargo of tanks and grain and medicine sank into darkness, never reaching the starving people who needed them. The U-boat crews were the best sailors Germany had. They trained for years to operate the complicated machines inside their steel tubes. Each man knew his job perfectly. The torpedo men could load and fire weapons in complete darkness. The engineers could repair broken engines with their eyes closed. The radio operators could send secret messages faster than anyone else in the world. These sailors believed they were unbeatable. Their leader, Admiral Karl Dönitz, told them they were winning the war all by themselves. He promised them medals and glory. He said the Americans were weak and stupid, building ships too fast and too cheap to fight properly. Inside the U-boats, the air smelled like diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and mold. Water dripped from the curved metal ceiling. The boats stayed underwater for days, hunting for convoys of merchant ships crossing the ocean. When they spotted targets, the U-boats attacked in groups called wolf packs. 10 or 15 submarines would surround a convoy at night. They would fire torpedoes from different directions at once. The merchant ships had nowhere to run. Their escort destroyers were too few and too slow to protect them all. By morning, burning oil covered the water for miles. Lifeboats drifted among the wreckage, filled with survivors who would die from cold before rescue came. The U-boat commanders kept diaries of their victories. They wrote down every ship they sank, counting the tons of cargo they sent to the ocean floor. Some captains sank 50 ships or more. The German people heard about these heroes on the radio. Newspapers printed their photographs. Young boys dreamed of joining the U-boat service when they grew up. The captains wore special badges showing how many enemy ships they had destroyed. In the officers' clubs back in France, where the U-boats refueled between patrols, the wine flowed freely. The men laughed and sang songs. They truly believed nothing could stop them. But in early 1943, something changed. The U-boat captains began noticing strange things during their patrols. Ships they were tracking would suddenly disappear from view, even on clear nights. Depth charges would explode around them before they even knew an enemy destroyer was nearby. It felt like the Allied ships could see in the dark, or read the U-boat commanders' minds. One submarine radioed back to base that it was under attack, but the captain said he could not see what was attacking him. The radio went silent. That U-boat never came home. More submarines vanished without explanation. Survivors who made it back to port told frightening stories. They described American destroyer escorts that appeared out of fog banks like ghosts. These ships were painted a special gray color that made them blend into the mist and rain. They moved faster than any escort ship the Germans had seen before. Their depth charges landed exactly where the U-boats were hiding, as if the Americans knew the precise location of every submarine. Some U-boat men swore these American ships could appear and disappear at will. Like spirits haunting the ocean. The German crews started calling these vessels the Gray Ghosts. At first, it was almost a joke, something to explain the unexplainable. But as more U-boats failed to return from patrol, the nickname took on a darker meaning. Experienced commanders who had survived dozens of missions began to feel fear in their stomachs. They were used to being the hunters, the ones who struck from darkness and disappeared. Now someone was hunting them the same way. The feeling of being watched, of being tracked by something you could not see, spread through the U-boat fleet like a diseased dot in the cramped sleeping quarters of the submarines. Men whispered to each other during the long hours underwater. They asked questions they were afraid to say out loud. How could the Americans find them so easily? Why did their torpedoes miss these new escort ships, even at close range? Where were all these vessels coming from? Berlin had promised that America could not build ships fast enough to matter. The propaganda officers said American sailors were poorly trained farm boys who would panic in real combat. But that was not what the U-boat crews were experiencing in the cold. Atlantic waters. One commander sent a final radio message that chilled everyone who heard it. His U-boat was northwest of the Azores Islands, hunting a convoy. The message crackled through the static. Being pursued by destroyer escort. Cannot identify. Speed impossible. They are everywhere. Cannot shake them. They are. The transmission ended. Rescue boats searched for wreckage for 3 days. They found nothing. It was as if the ocean had simply swallowed the submarine whole, leaving not even an oil slick behind. The Gray Ghosts had arrived, and the men who once ruled the Atlantic were becoming the prey. Something had changed in this war, something the German High Command had not predicted. The U-boat crews could feel it in their bones during every patrol. The ocean that had once been their hunting ground now felt like a trap. And somewhere in the fog and waves, the Gray Ghosts were waiting. The truth about the Gray Ghosts came in pieces, like a puzzle the U-boat crews did not want to solve. These were not the destroyers Berlin had described in their intelligence reports. The German Naval Command had told the U-boat captains to expect slow, poorly built ships thrown together in American shipyards by workers who barely knew what they were doing. The reports said these vessels would be easy targets, crewed by men with only a few weeks of training. Every part of that information turned out to be a lie. The first shock was the radar. U-boats had equipment that could detect when enemy radar waves hit their hull. For years, this gave them warning when British destroyers were searching for them. The U-boat could dive deep and slip away before the enemy got close. But the American Gray Ghosts used a new type of radar that German equipment could not hear. It was called centimetric radar because it used much shorter radio waves than anything that existed before. The U-boat's warning receivers stayed completely silent while American ships tracked them perfectly through darkness, fog, and storm. A U-boat captain might think he was safe on the surface at midnight, charging his batteries under cover of clouds. Then suddenly, searchlights would snap on from just a few hundred yards away. A Gray Ghost would be city. The American ships attacked with weapons the Germans had never seen. Instead of dropping depth charges off the back of the ship, the Gray Ghosts fired mortar forward called hedgehogs. 24 small bombs launched through the air in a pattern, flying ahead of the destroyer escort while it was still moving at full speed. The bombs only exploded if they hit something solid. A U-boat commander would hear the strange whistling sound of hedgehog bombs flying overhead. If he heard nothing else, he knew the attack had missed. But if he heard even one explosion, it meant his submarine had been hit. And one hit from a hedgehog could crack a U-boat's pressure hull like an egg. The ocean would crush the submarine in seconds, killing everyone inside before they could even scream. Worse than the weapons was something the U-boats could not see or hear at all. The Americans had invented a way to find submarines just by listening to their radio messages. Every time a U-boat reported finding a convoy, or asked for weather information, or sent any message at all, American ships could figure out exactly where that radio signal came from. The system was called high-frequency direction finding, but sailors just called it Huff-Duff, 3 or 4. American ships would each measure the direction of a U-boat's radio transmission. Where those lines crossed on a map was where the submarine was hiding. The Gray Ghost could race to that spot and start attacking before the U-boat captain even finished his message to headquarters. German commanders started to realize that every time they used their radios, they were painting a target on their own hull. But the most terrifying thing was not the technology. It was how many of these ships existed. A U-boat that damaged one Gray Ghost and escaped would find 2 more hunting it the next day. Sink one of them, and 3 more would appear by the end of the week. The American shipyards were building destroyer escorts faster than Germany could construct submarines. Much faster. One shipyard in California could finish a complete destroyer escort in just 40 days from the moment they laid the keel. American workers riveted the hull together in massive covered buildings where thousands of people worked day and night in 3 shifts. They used assembly line methods, building identical pieces in factories, and then putting them together like toys. Germany's submarines took 8 months to build, one at a time. In bomb-damaged shipyards that the British attacked every few weeks, one U-boat commander was captured after his submarine was forced to surface by depth charge damage. British sailors pulled him from the water and put him on a destroyer escort that was only 3 weeks old. The paint still smelled fresh. He stared at the radar equipment, the neat corridors, the well-fed crew members who looked barely old enough to shave. Through a porthole, he saw 2 more identical Gray Ghosts sailing alongside in perfect formation. The British captain, who spoke German, told him something that made his stomach turn cold. America had already built more than 200 of these vessels. They were planning to build 500 more. At that moment, Germany had less than 400 U-boats in total, and most of them were in dock getting repaired. The mathematics of the war had changed. But the U-boat crews were only beginning to understand how badly. They were still following orders to attack convoys, still trying to sink as many merchant ships as possible. But now, for every convoy they found, the Gray Ghosts found them. The hunted had become the hunters. U-boats that used to patrol on the surface in daylight now stayed underwater for days, creeping along at slow speed, terrified to make any noise that might give away their position. The men inside breathed stale air that smelled like sweat and fear. They listened to the ping of enemy sonar echoing through the hull like a blind man tapping with a cane. Searching for them in the darkness. Young sailors who had volunteered for U-boat duty because it seemed heroic and exciting now wrote letters home that never mentioned glory. They wrote about nightmares and the sound of depth charges. They wrote about friends who left port and never came back. The older commanders stopped wearing their victory badges. In the bars where U-boat crews gathered between missions, the singing had stopped. Men sat quietly and drank until they could sleep without dreaming about drowning in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean. And somewhere in the gray mist of the Atlantic, the American destroyer escorts kept hunting. Patient and silent as death itself, Captain Lieutenant Hans Werner thought he would die like most U-boat commanders did, trapped in a steel coffin at the bottom of the Atlantic. Instead, he surrendered on a cold morning in April 1944, after 18 hours of continuous hunting by an American destroyer escort. His submarine had taken damage from depth charges. Water leaked through cracks in the hull. The batteries were dead. The air tasted like poison. When he finally surfaced and opened the hatch, fresh wind hit his face like a blessing. His crew climbed out with their hands raised. They were so tired they could barely stand. American sailors pulled them aboard a ship with the number 403 painted on its gray hull. Werner expected to be thrown in chains, maybe beaten, certainly treated like the enemy. Instead, a young sailor handed him a wool blanket and a cup of hot coffee. The American looked about 19 years old, with red hair and freckles. He smiled and said something in English that Werner did not understand, but the tone was friendly, almost apologetic. Werner wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and held the coffee cup with shaking hands. He had not been warm or clean in 42 days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They took him below deck while his crew stayed topside under guard. Werner expected a dark cell, but instead they led him through corridors that gleamed with fresh paint and electric lights. Everything was clean. The floors were not covered in oil and rust. The air smelled like soap instead of diesel fuel. He passed the crew's sleeping quarters and saw actual beds with mattresses, not the narrow bunks where U-boat men slept in shifts, 3 men sharing 2 beds. The American sailors looked healthy and well-fed. Their uniforms were clean. Some of them were drinking something brown from glass bottles. Later he learned it was called Coca-Cola. An officer who spoke perfect German brought Werner to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. The officer was a lieutenant commander, maybe 30 years old, with calm eyes and a polite manner. He offered Werner a cigarette from a fresh pack. Werner took it with trembling fingers. The tobacco tasted better than anything he remembered. The American asked him basic questions. Name, rank, which U-boat? Werner answered what military rules allowed him to say. The officer did not push. He seemed almost bored, like this happened every day. Werner realized with a sick feeling that it probably did happen every day. How many U-boats had this one ship captured or sunk? The officer stood up and said Werner could rest before being transferred to a prison camp. But first, did he want to see something interesting? Werner did not understand what the American meant, but he nodded. They walked through more corridors, going up metal stairs until they reached a door marked with words Werner could not read. The officer opened it and gestured for him to enter. Inside was a room full of equipment that looked like it came from a science fiction story. Green screens glowed in the darkness, showing sweeping lines and bright dots. 2 young sailors sat at controls, watching the screens with casual attention. One of them was eating a sandwich. This was the radar room, Werner realized. This was how they had found his submarine in the dark. The officer explained in simple German how the system worked. The radar could see 60 miles in any direction. It could spot a surfaced U-boat even in a storm. The equipment never got tired. It never blinked. It watched everything, all the time. Werner stared at the screens and felt something break inside his chest. Germany had nothing like this. Nothing even close. He had been operating blind while the Americans could see everything. The officer walked into another room where radio equipment covered an entire wall. He explained about Huff Duff, how every radio transmission gave away a submarine's location. Werner thought about all the times he had radioed headquarters to report his position, to ask for orders, to warn other U-boats about enemy ships. Every single time, he had been telling the Americans exactly where to find him. The American lieutenant commander watched Werner's face change as understanding sank in. The officer said something that Werner would remember for the rest of his life. He said America had built 563 of these destroyer escorts. 563 identical ships, all with the same radar, all with the same weapons, all hunting U-boats every day and night. He asked Werner, in a voice that was not cruel but simply matter of fact, how many submarines Germany had left. Werner knew the answer. Maybe 300 still at sea. Maybe. He had believed Germany was winning because that was what Berlin told them. He had believed American ships were crude and inferior because that was what the propaganda officers said. He had believed the Reich would triumph through superior will and German engineering. But standing in this room, surrounded by technology his country could not match, on a ship his nation could not build fast enough, Crewed by young men who seemed almost relaxed about hunting submarines, Werner understood the war was lost. Had always been lost. Germany never had a chance. They took him to a bunk in a locked room that was still nicer than his quarters on the U-boat. He lay in the darkness and thought about his crew. 48 men had started the war with him. Only 11 were still alive. The rest were dead at the bottom of the ocean, drowned in submarines that were supposed to be invisible hunters, but turned out to be targets. He thought about the gray ghosts, which were not ghosts at all. They were simply better. Better technology, better production, better strategy. The American system worked. The German system, built on lies and ideology and promises of racial superiority, had sent 30,000 U-boat sailors to their deaths for nothing. Werner closed his eyes but could not sleep. The ship's engines hummed steadily beneath him. Somewhere above, the radar screens kept sweeping, watching an ocean that held no secrets from American eyes. The hunter had been hunted, caught, and shown the truth. And the truth was worse than drowning. The war ended in May 1945, but Hans Werner did not go home until November. The Americans kept him in a prison camp in Virginia for 6 months after Germany surrendered. The camp sat in green farmland that reminded him of Bavaria, except everything was bigger and the food never ran out. 3 meals every day. Real meat twice a week. Fresh bread that did not have sawdust mixed in the flour. The prisoners worked on nearby farms, harvesting corn and apples. The farmers paid them small amounts of money that they could spend at the camp store. Werner bought chocolate bars and saved them in a box under his bunk. He had not seen chocolate in 4 years. At night, the German prisoners sat in their barracks and talked about home. Most of them had not heard from their families since 1944. The mail system had collapsed when the Russians invaded from the east and the Americans from the west. Werner had a wife named Greta and a daughter named Helga, who would be 9 years old now. He carried their photograph in his wallet, wrapped in wax paper to keep it dry. The picture was from 1940. Greta stood in front of their apartment building in Kiel, holding baby Helga in her arms. Both of them were smiling. Werner looked at that photograph every night before sleeping and wondered if they were still alive. Kiel was a naval base. The British had bombed it over and over. Maybe his building was just rubble now. Maybe his family was buried under it. The American camp commander called Werner into his office one October morning. The commander was a tired-looking colonel who spoke a little German. He told Werner he was going home. A ship would take him and 200 other prisoners back to Hamburg in 3 weeks. The colonel pushed papers across his desk for Werner to sign. Then he asked a question that seemed strange. He asked if Werner had enough warm clothes for the German winter. Werner looked down at his prison uniform and said he supposed it would have to do. The colonel nodded slowly, then opened a closet and pulled out a thick wool coat, a sweater, 2 pairs of socks, and a knitted hat. He put them on the desk. He said these things were extras, not needed anymore, and Werner should take them. His voice suggested this was an order, not a favor. Werner took the clothes and thanked him. The colonel looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something else, but did not know how. The ship left from New York Harbor on a cold morning in early November. Werner stood at the rail with other prisoners and watched the city disappear behind them. The buildings were so tall they seemed impossible. Lights blazed from every window even though the war was over and no one needed to save electricity anymore. Cars filled the streets in long rivers of metal and color. The harbor itself held more ships than Werner had ever seen in one place. Cargo vessels loading and unloading, passenger ships coming and going, naval vessels being painted and repaired. Everything moved with organized purpose. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was burned. America had fought a war on 2 sides of the planet, and the war had never touched their homeland at all. The voyage across the Atlantic took 12 days. The ship served them 2 meals a day of soup and bread. It was prison food, not luxury, but it was enough. Werner spent most of his time on deck, staring at the gray ocean. He thought about all the men who died down there in the darkness, trapped in steel tubes, lungs burning as water rushed in. He thought about the convoys his U-boat had attacked, merchant sailors screaming as their ships went down. He thought about the gray ghosts that had hunted him, efficient and relentless as machines. The ocean looked empty and peaceful now, but Werner knew what was hidden beneath the surface. Thousands of wrecks scattered across the seafloor. Ships and submarines mixed together in the mud. The winners and losers all ended up in the same graveyard. They arrived in Hamburg on a morning of cold rain. The ship docked in a harbor that was mostly ruins. Bombed-out warehouses lined the waterfront. Cranes lay toppled in the water like fallen trees. The prisoners walked down the gangplank onto German soil for the first time in years. Werner expected to feel joy or relief, but instead he felt numb. This did not look like the Germany he remembered. British and American soldiers directed them through customs checks. The signs were in English. The military trucks were American. The food in the processing center came from American rations. Germany was not really a country anymore. It was a place that other countries controlled. They gave Werner papers showing he was released and free to travel. He walked out of the processing center into the ruined city. The train station was partly destroyed, but still operating. He used his last American money to buy a ticket to Kiel. The train was crowded with people who looked like ghosts themselves. Thin faces, empty eyes, clothes held together with patches and string. An old woman sat across from him holding a small bag that she guarded with both hands like it contained treasure. Werner watched the countryside pass outside the dirty window. Every city they went through showed bomb damage. Factories were just shells of walls with no roofs. Bridges were rebuilt with temporary wooden supports. Fields that should have been plowed for winter wheat sat empty and wild. The train reached Kiel in the early evening. Werner walked from the station toward the neighborhood where he used to live. The streets were unfamiliar. Whole blocks had been flattened. Piles of rubble still sat where buildings once stood. People had made paths through the debris, walking in single file like ants navigating a destroyed anthill. Children played in the ruins, climbing on broken concrete and searching for anything useful. They looked hungry. Their clothes hung loose on thin bodies. Werner had to ask directions 3 times before he found his street. Half of it no longer existed, but his building was still standing. The top 2 floors were gone, burned away in some long-ago fire, but the bottom 3 floors remained. The windows were covered with boards and cloth instead of glass. Werner climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the damaged stairwell. His apartment had been on the 2nd floor. The door was different from the one he remembered. Someone had replaced it with rough wood planks. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Finally he heard movement inside. The door opened a crack and a woman's face peered out. It took him 3 seconds to recognize Greta. She had lost so much weight, her cheekbones stuck out sharp as knives. Her hair was gray instead of brown. She looked 50 instead of 34. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then she pulled the door wide and grabbed him, her arms surprisingly strong, pulling him inside and holding him so tight he could barely breathe. Helga came running from the back room. She was 9 now, tall and skinny with her mother's eyes. She did not remember him. She hung back, shy and uncertain, while Greta cried into Werner's shoulder. The apartment was freezing cold. They had furniture made from scrap wood and crates. The windows were stuffed with rags to keep wind out. One small stove in the corner burned something that smelled like tar. Greta pulled back and touched his face with both hands, as if checking that he was real. She said she thought he was dead. No letters had come for over a year. Other wives on their street had received death notices about their husbands. She had assumed Werner's notice was simply lost in the chaos. Werner reached into his bag and pulled out the things he had brought. The wool coat from the American colonel, the sweater and socks and hat, the chocolate bars he had saved for months, a small bag of coffee he had bought from another prisoner who worked in the camp kitchen. Greta stared at these items like they were miracles. She picked up the coat and held it to her face, feeling the thick wool. She unwrapped a chocolate bar carefully and broke off a small piece for Helga, who ate it slowly with her eyes closed. Werner watched them and felt shame burn in his chest. He had been a prisoner eating regular meals and sleeping in a warm bunk, while his family froze and starved in the ruins of a war Germany started. That night, after Helga went to sleep, Werner and Greta sat by the small stove and talked in whispers. She told him what the last year had been like. The bombing that never stopped. The fires that burned for days. The Russian soldiers who came through after the surrender, taking whatever they wanted. The struggle to find food. She worked cleaning buildings for British officers now, and they paid her in food rations. That was how they survived. She asked him what the American prison camp was like. Werner did not know how to answer. He said it was not like a camp at all, really. More like a small town with fences. She asked if they treated him badly. He shook his head. They treated him better than his own Navy had treated him on the U-boat. Werner reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. He had started writing in it during his last months as a prisoner. He opened it to a page marked with a string and read Greta what he had written there. He read about boarding the American destroyer escort after surrendering. About the radar room with screens that could see everything. About the officer who told him America had built 560, three identical ships while Germany struggled to build 300 submarines. He read about standing in that room and understanding that everything Berlin had told them was a lie. Germany had never been close to winning. The entire war had been built on false promises and propaganda. 30,000 U-boat sailors died because old men in offices lied about American weakness. Greta listened with her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said something that surprised him. She said she had known they were losing for 2 years. All the women knew. They could tell from the ration cuts and the bombing and the lists of dead soldiers that grew longer every week. But they could not say it out loud. Anyone who suggested Germany might lose could be arrested. So they stayed silent and hoped their men would come home. She asked Werner what he learned from being captured by the Americans. He closed the notebook and stared at the dying fire in the stove. He told her about the gray ghosts. Not the ghost story version that U-boat crews told to explain the unexplainable, but the truth. The American destroyer escorts were not supernatural or magical. They were simply the products of a system that worked better than Germany's system. Better technology invented by free scientists. Better production organized by skilled workers who were paid well and fed well. Better strategy from military leaders who valued results over ideology. The Americans won because their society was built on things that actually worked, while Germany's was built on myths and lies about racial superiority. The gray ghosts proved that hard work and smart thinking beat propaganda and hatred every single time. Werner said the nickname itself revealed everything. The U-boat crews called them ghosts because they could not understand how they were being beaten by Americans they had been told were inferior. It was easier to believe in supernatural ships than to accept that German ideas about the world were completely wrong. But there was nothing supernatural about radar and hedgehog mortar and assembly line production. There was nothing ghostly about 500 ships built in less time than it took Germany to build 100 submarines. The gray ghosts were not ghosts. They were the future. And Germany had been the past, drowning in an ocean, haunted by its own lies. Greta reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were rough and scarred from work. She said they would rebuild somehow. Start again. Make sure Helga grew up in a world where people told the truth instead of beautiful lies. Werner nodded and squeezed her hand. Outside, the cold wind rattled the boards covering their windows. Somewhere in the ruins of Kiel, a child cried from hunger. The war was over, but its consequences would last for decades. Werner had survived when 3/4 of his comrades had not. He would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life, along with the memory of standing in a radar room and watching his entire understanding of the world collapse. Years later, when Helga was grown with children of her own, she asked her father what the war taught him. Werner thought about the question for a long time. Finally, he told her the same thing he told everyone who asked. He said the gray ghosts taught him that truth always wins in the end. You can tell yourself comfortable lies for a while. You can believe your enemies are weak and your cause is righteous. But eventually reality comes for you, painted gray and invisible in the fog, and reality does not care about your myths. The gray ghosts were not ghosts at all. They were simply what happens when a free society builds things that actually work. And that, Werner said, was more terrifying than any ghost story ever told. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.